Keto and crime, keto and crime. We uncover the grime on keto and crime. Keto and crime, keto and crime. Now is the time for keto and crime.
Hey everyone, Tracy here from Keto and Crime. Thank you so much to every single one of my patrons and channel members. You make this possible. And you're one of the reasons I do this. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if I haven't said it before, thank you. I'll sing it. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with me and letting me geek out, not making fun of me like a lot of other people do, because I like weird stuff about crime and dark history. Thanks, everyone. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Keto and Crime. I'm finally back. And I do apologize for my shorter videos of late and all the rescheduled live streams. I'm going to get that schedule nailed down. But I have had some issues that I couldn't control that came up, and for that, I do apologize. But I'm back, 2 to 3 videos a week from here on out. And I want to shout out to my patrons, my channel members. Thank you so much. I know I've been MIA. I will make that up to all of you. And with that being said, let's dive in to a very tedious subject that I think is interesting. The doctors, and especially the nurses of the Third Reich. So, let's dive in, shall we? To really understand what is happening during this time period with those in the medical profession in Nazi Germany, there's a word that we all have to learn together: eugenics. I'm sure you've heard it. It's been the subject of many sci-fi movies, and it holds a place of infamy in human history. But basically, it's the study of how to selectively breed people. That's the best way to do it. It was patented, well, not even really patented, but the whole pseudoscience behind eugenics was developed largely by a man named Sir Francis Galton, but it has largely been discredited because unlike when we do this with animals like cattle, horses, dogs, cats, for certain traits that we want to see in them, such as loyalty, strength, speed, quality of meat, that's pretty objective. A hardworking horse is a hardworking horse, whereas the traits that are wanted in human beings, we get into the subjective a lot, and it does breed bigotry, racism, supremacy of one type of person over another, and that's the reason that the whole study of eugenics has been largely discredited and moved out. But it's not unusual in the realm of human history. Humans have practiced it in one way or another since the dawn of time. Can go all the way back to the dawns of both Eastern and Western civilization, where male children were preferable to female children, and where oftentimes, if there was some limit on the amount of births, the female children would be killed. You can go all the way back to the dawn of Western civilization with the Spartans. Well documented that if a child did not meet their subjective definition of a perfect child, that is one that was a boy that could grow into a soldier or some other useful profession, they would be disposed of. The same way with girls. Many Native American and indigenous tribes practiced the same thing, often sacrificing the weaker children to their gods. And so people have done this, and there wasn't even science behind it. It was just, this child will not make it in our society, therefore the most merciful thing to do is to get rid of the child. and this has happened for centuries. But it wasn't until the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, where they really started looking into the science behind it, much like we do with selective breeding of animals. Dr. Francis Galton coined the term eugenics and actually discussed, based on his readings of Darwin and Darwinism, that it was kind of possible to selectively breed traits among humans to get a better outcome. And this also included not allowing certain types of people to breed. So basically it was deemed genetic determinism, later on eugenics, which, if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, it's exactly what they do. If you've ever seen The Matrix, it's exactly what they do. So the things that this gentleman actually studied and put forth as a way of being able to determine the type of people that, lived in a certain society are the things that horror and sci-fi movies are made out of today. It really caught hold in the early 20th century, and a lot of countries grabbed onto this, including here in the United States, sadly enough. There were international conferences for eugenic scientists where they talked about how to make society stronger, and they even talked about very controversial subjects like sterilization of certain types of people. And countries that embraced this were the United States, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Sweden. And they felt it was for the good of their society to only populate their society with the best of the best. And now we're going to talk about eugenics as it occurred here in the U.S. In the United States, a lot of the early forms of eugenics centered around segregation, racial segregation. For many, many years, intermarrying between two different races was illegal in the United States, and this was based on a philosophy that each race should be kept pure. And I'm getting into some really dark material, and Susan is probably somewhere beating on a war drum right now, but it's part of history, and history is not always clean and sanitary. But basically, that's how it kind of originated in the United States, is a lot of racial intermarrying laws. Even when interracial relationships happened and offspring happened from those relationships, you often had those children being treated much, much differently than somebody that was 100% one type of person versus 100% another type of person. The term mulatto became very, very prominent to denote a half European, half African ancestral child. And the same with half Native American, half African American were known by the term Creole. So they had whole different terms for people that they considered an entirely different race of people. And please bear with me. I promise that we're going to get through this. Just bear with me. In addition, there were many laws in the United States that laid out mandatory sterilization for people that were handicapped, either mentally or physically. They did not want them breeding. For fear that the child would be more likely to have the same kind of disability. And that's how you kind of evolved. Don't want to get into politics, but the whole founding of Planned Parenthood, there was eugenics behind that. It's there in the reading. Margaret Sanger put the clinics in areas where people that, in her opinion, were not fit to raise children would have more access to abortion. I'm going to leave it at that. And, yeah, so a lot of this but there was positive things that came out of eugenics. Thanks to the study of eugenics, we were able to determine certain things caused better outcomes, that you could prevent certain types of birth defects by doing X, Y, or Z that did not involve restrictions on reproduction. You had a ban on inbreeding among families, as that was pretty prominent, being that a lot of our ancestors came from Europe. Inbreeding was very popular, especially among the higher classes in Europe. So it was the study of eugenics that kind of showed might not need to do that. You know, if you study the family of Queen Victoria, you'll see that most of the royal families of Europe were related to Victoria, and they all had hemophilia. So it's things like that were later on prevented by the study of eugenics. So it wasn't all bad, but it certainly wasn't all good. And then, of course, fast forward to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, and you saw eugenics on steroids. Germany in the 1920s was a decimated country. They had just lost World War I. And the blame for the loss of World War I was put squarely on the shoulders of the people that absolutely had nothing to do with it, and that was non-white Aryan Germans. Germans that were not of Nordic descent. Everybody blamed them, said that they had more loyalty to the Russian side than they did the German side, and that's the reason that they lost the war. Instead of placing it on the hands of the army, the government, and where it actually belonged, it was squarely on the minority classes in Germany. And Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party grasped onto this, fed by his own intense hatred for Jews, even though he was most likely Jewish himself. We'll get into that another time. Certainly played up on that and fed into it. And by 1933, when basically the Nazis had infiltrated Parliament and had basically won the highest offices in the land and were basically in charge, you had this becoming one of their prime objectives. You started hearing the terms racial hygiene or eugenics, and it was enthusiastically preached from the highest levels of government. And along with this came mass discrimination against people that were not pure Aryan Germans. Jews, homosexuals, because they didn't fit the model of what Germans thought a German should be. People of Russian descent, people with African blood in them, and people with gypsies, and anybody else, literally, that did not fit the mode of a regular German. Basically, the handicapped, the chronically ill, the mentally deficient. All of these became targets for German ire and the blame for the loss. Now, Germany was decimated. It could only maintain an army of 100,000. Its economy was in the toilet, especially after the stock market crash of 1929. And Hitler, again, blamed all of that on these said groups of people that had really nothing at all to do with it. But widespread discrimination, you literally could not hold a job, and you certainly could not hold a job with any prestige if you were not what the Nazis considered a true, perfect Aryan German. And so at that time you had Jewish doctors, lawyers, professors, anybody that was of a minority group that held such offices were immediately fired. You know, think of The Handmaid's Tale when all the women were fired. Same kind of thing. They fired all of the people that weren't pure Aryan Germans, and to top it all, because roughly 70–80% of Germany joined the Nazi Party, you had to also be part of the party to be successful, and that means that more than half of German doctors and nurses had to join the Nazi Party to keep their job. And from the highest levels, the whole idea of racial hygiene was fed through politics, into academia, and then into medicine, and you had doctors and nurses at the forefront of basically a killing field. For them, it came more about the party and what was best for Germany, or just passive agreement. They were afraid. They couldn't do anything about it, and it could cost them their life, their freedom. So why risk that to help these people? So it became less about the Hippocratic Oath and more about, I think, survival. And I'm not saying that they were all innocent, but they weren't all guilty either. Think about it. Your average middle-class German nurse, and at the time, nursing did not have the prestige that it has now. Nurses were kind of disposable. I mean, it wasn't until, you know, I mean, you did have Clara Barton and the Red Cross. You had other things that had made nursing much more palatable and much more prestigious, but still, it's not at the level that it was now. So, you know, nurses were kind of a dime a dozen. And so here I am, this little middle-class nurse flopping out a living in Germany, and I've got somebody telling me that if I don't follow these things, I'm going to lose my job. I can't feed my family. Now, I know what you're going to talk about, you know, that I was following orders. I understand that. But you also have to kind of understand the position that these people were in, and that being in a financially failing country, a country that was reeling from the loss of a world war, and a country that was pretty much hated by the rest of the world, they didn't feel any loyalty to the rest of the world. They wanted to advance Germany to being the great Germany that they knew about, of their past. And so that was their concern. Think about living in that kind of environment. So they passively agreed to do the things that they were asked to do. And one of the first things that occurred was the systematic sterilization of disabled and both physically and mentally disabled people. That was done in hospitals, by doctors, and by nurses. And later, that spiraled into euthanasia of these various types of people, usually those that could not speak up. That, just like the Nazi doctors would later choose the people getting off the trains at the concentration camps, which ones would live and which ones would die, they were doing that much earlier on, as early as 1934, in German hospitals. They would identify people that were not worth the resources, in their opinion, to keep them alive, and they would systematically kill these people. If they were merciful, it would be by lethal injection. If they weren't feeling so merciful, they would starve them, perform heinous medical experiments, or basically withhold treatment. If they had a physical ailment like asthma, like COPD, like emphysema, like cancer, they would withhold treatment for that and just let them die. And lots of times nurses passively contributed to this by, they were the ones holding the people, they were the ones giving the injections, they were the ones not giving food to these people. And lots of times they were under kind of threat themselves. So, but yeah. And later on, this went as far as mass gassing and what is known as the Achtung T4 campaign, where these people were not only the handicapped, but anybody that did not meet the model of a German, the early version of the concentration camps. They were actually taken to certain locations around Germany and gassed. And it was well known. There were, you know, jokes around Germany that the certain colored gray buses, you don't want to be on that bus. So these were people that were coined by doctors and nurses as not being worth it, whether they were handicapped, whether they were mentally deficient, or whether they just happened to be gay. They would be put on these buses and sent to be euthanized. In addition to these people, their families were often sterilized under rule of law too, to prevent further breeding of these types of people. So if you were parents that gave birth to a Down syndrome baby, not only would your baby be taken from you and euthanized, you would be sterilized so that you could no longer reproduce. And people allowed this to happen. I don't get it, but they did. By the end of the war, over 400,000 people died this way, and hundreds of thousands of more were sterilized to prevent this type of person from being born again. Whole psychiatric hospitals were emptied out, whole hospitals for the disabled were emptied out, and hundreds of thousands of women were forced into tubal ligations. Notice they didn't snip the men. It was just the women had to have tubal ligations. And basically, epileptics, schizophrenics, people with bipolar disorder, then known as manic depressive, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, anybody that was homosexual or cross-dressed or anything that would fall under what I call the premium pack, you know, my people, the LGBT, anybody that falls under that, gone, killed. Anybody that was intersex, anybody that was actually born with male and female genitalia, gone. Anybody that was just considered weak or feeble-minded. Now, this meant that people high up in the German echelons could just say that person's feeble-minded. And, you know, so think about millions of Jewish people disappeared, but these are the unsung victims of the Nazi regime as well. This later spiraled into genetic testing for anybody that was about to get married, and if any kind of racial impurity or genetic impurity was found, they would not issue a marriage license, and they would be, if it was the woman, they would be sterilized. There was forced abortions of anybody that was considered weak, frail-minded, that had gotten pregnant. There would be a forced abortion. And Hitler wrote about this. He actually wrote a second book. It was not published until way after his death. It was just called Second Book. He praised Sparta and praised his actions for doing these sort of things to the German people to keep them racially pure. And of course, all this culminated with Nazi doctors, Nazi nurses being at the forefront in the concentration camps, choosing which prisoners would live and which prisoners would die. And finally, it all came crashing down with the defeat of the Nazis, thank goodness. And then you had the Nuremberg trials. There was over 10,000 medical professionals that were tried at Nuremberg. The ones that were executed were 90% doctors, because they felt they had the authority to actually do something, whereas nurses didn't necessarily did. Now, there were some nurses that were executed as well, but there were also a lot of nurses that came out of it being in a much better light. There were stories of nurses that when they transferred to concentration camps, they would smuggle in food, they would smuggle in medicine, they would help people escape. So there was a lot of hero nurses and doctors that are unsung that fought against this, but the vast majority of them just passively complied. And are they heroes? Are they villains? I don't think they're either. I think they're just ordinary people that were put in unprecedented strain and evil and had to comply for their very survival. But since World War II, eugenics, at least in the modern world, has been totally thrown out, except for the good things that we did learn from it, i.e. no inbreeding, how to prevent birth defects, that sort of thing. But, yeah, human history is kind of dark sometimes. We're not always the nicest to each other. And this was hard. This was hard. I read a lot of books. I watched a lot of documentaries. Yeah, this was hard. But there were doctors and nurses that killed in Nazi Germany's, and they killed for Hitler. But it all came to an end, and now hopefully we're in more merciful times, you know. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this very brief scratching the surface of doctors and nurses of the Third Reich. I hope you enjoy it. And with that being said, I'll be back very, very soon with another true crime video. And until next time, keep on crime.